This is the day when you take everything you have learned, everything you have trained for, everything you have been taught and coached to do, and you put it on the line to see if you can overcome your opponent. And yes, it can be a little bit scary and even a little bit intimidating, because when you step on that field, you put yourself on public display, and yes, you will be judged by your performance and by the outcome of the game.
Welcome to the Game Day Everyday Podcast with Coach Bud Boughton. When you make every day a game day, you live a life that matters. Here's Coach Bud.
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, men and women of all ages. Thank you so much for joining me on my very first podcast, Game Day Every Day. My name is Bud Boughton, and I want to thank you very much for joining me on this, my very first podcast. Since we have not formally met, let me introduce myself, give you a little bit of history and background. Really, today I want to talk about why did I choose to name my podcast Game Day Every Day. So a little background and history. First of all, you should know I'm probably older than 90% of my listening audience. So I don't have to tell you how old I am, but I've been around the block a few times. And let me tell you, I have been beyond blessed in my life, and I have had many, many wonderful experiences. I grew up in a wonderful family in a suburb of Buffalo, New York. I had wonderful, supportive parents and two brothers, an older brother, a younger brother, and we, all three of us, grew up in a very strong, athletic-minded family. In fact, from the time I was 8 years old through my senior year in college, I played organized sports in 8 different sports that included football, basketball, baseball, hockey, swimming and diving, wrestling, track and field, and lacrosse. But clearly my focus and very much of my identity when I was growing up was tied to football. My senior year in college, I just was in the right place at the right time, played for an undefeated football team at Ashland University. Back then it was Ashland College, but we went 11-0, and we had many great honors come our way as a result of that 11-0 season. In my adult life, I've had the experience of working for 3 different Fortune 500 companies, and I've been an officer of a publicly traded company. So, you know what? I've been in the corporate world. I know what the corporate world is all about. I know what those pressures are like that many of you who may be young professionals starting your career working in the corporate world, I have been there and I understand that. And in my adult life, I should also tell you, I have spent 15 seasons helping coach an NCAA Division III college football team, and I've also served as their team chaplain. So I've had some great experiences athletically in the corporate world, etc. I'm currently married. I'm a father. I'm a grandfather. Yes, I would tell you I haven't had all sunshine and unicorns in my life. I've been through the pain and disappointment of divorce, only to be blessed in my current marriage to my elementary school sweetheart. I am married to a wonderful lady who was my girlfriend first grade through the 7th grade, and amazingly God has blessed us both, brought us back together in this life, and we've been married now for over 20 years. More than anything else, I want you to know that I am a man of faith who has been totally blessed in this life. Over the many years I have been on this planet, believe me, I've seen the ups and downs. I've felt the sunshine on my face on the mountaintop, and I've had my moments in the darkness of the valley. But believe me, I've been to both places. I've seen them both. And the thing that I've learned about life is that really we can only live it one day at a time. And as a man of faith, the man who has learned to put his trust in Jesus Christ, I now want to make every day count. So where does this game day part of all this come in? Well, as I've already explained, my participation in competitive athletics has always been a major part of my life. As a former athlete and coach, I am of the belief that there is no better place to learn some of the valuable life lessons that can be learned on the playing fields in various venues where competitive sports are played. Understanding things like the value of teamwork, personal sacrifice, self-discipline, acceptance of our diversity, developing the competitive spirit. And a big one is that whole thing of resilience, learning to get back up after you've been knocked down. There are so many valuable lessons that can be learned in competitive athletics. And while much of the learning comes in the off-season, in the training programs, the practices, there is nothing that stirs the emotions and desire of an athlete like those two words, game day. You know, game day is the day when you put everything on the line. This is the day when you take everything you have learned, everything you have trained for, everything you have been taught and coached to do, and you put it on the line to see if you can overcome your opponent. And yes, it can be a little bit scary and even a little bit intimidating, because when you step on that field, you put yourself on public display, and yes, you will be judged by your performance and by the outcome of the game. And we all know some days you win and some days you learn. That's right. Some days you win and some days you learn. Notice I didn't say some days you lose, because you know what? Ultimately, even on a game day when you are not victorious, when it's one of those tough days and you come out on the losing end of it, that's when we often learn the greatest lessons. So as a former athlete and coach, if there's one thing I loved, it was and is game day. But not long ago, I came to an interesting realization about my involvement in athletics and especially football. I have a website that you can go to. It's just www.budboughton.com. In writing a recent blog, I did some research. I said, geez, you know, football has been such a big part of my life, and all those game days. I wonder how many there really were. So I went back through all the scrapbooks and yearbooks, things that I had, and counted them up. And actual game days, I had 113 game days in my life. Now, that's over 14 seasons of playing organized football, starting when I was 8 years old up through my senior year in college. Interestingly, my win-loss record was 88 wins and 25 losses. And over those 14 seasons, I played for 8 league-winning championship teams that included several undefeated seasons. But this is what jumped out at me. As I look at how old I am now, those 113 game days make up less than 0.5% of my life. I mean, it actually comes out to 0.446. That's less than half of 1%. Less than half of 1% of my life. And yet, those game days were such big days. I mean, they were life-changing for me. And when I saw that, I just suddenly realized, wait a second, those game days, I still remember things from scores, from actual individual plays that I was involved in. But I said, gosh, why shouldn't every day of my life be as exciting as those game days were? How can I make my life, every day of my life, a game day? As I look back over those 113 game days, there was one that was truly, truly life-changing. And that's the story I want to share with you. It actually begins on Halloween 1971. October 31st, 1971. I'm playing an away game for Ashland College. We're playing Western Illinois University. My mom and dad were not at the game. They stayed at home in Buffalo, New York to watch my younger brother play in his high school game, which, as it turned out, was against our crosstown rival, and it was for the league championship, a big game. As it turns out, I lose my game 21-20 that day. We got beat by 1 point. Tough loss. I come home. I'm in the dorm. This is before the days of cell phones, folks. I mean, that's what it was. So I went to the payphone. I called home excitedly. I wanted to find out how my younger brother had done. And my mom said, oh my gosh, you lost 21-20. Well, guess what? Your younger brother got beat by the identical score, 21-20. And then she said this, but we've got some bigger problems here. I didn't know what she meant by that, but the next thing she told me is, your dad suffered a stroke while watching your brother's game. And I'm like, what? First of all, what is a stroke? I'm all of 20 years old. I've heard that, but I don't even know what a stroke is and how it impacts somebody. And my mom went on to explain that my dad's in the hospital, didn't know what the prognosis would be. Long story short, he actually had a second stroke while he was in the hospital, and 48 hours later, I'm on an airplane back to Buffalo, New York, because my dad's in intensive care. He's in a coma on life support, and we don't know if he's even going to make it. I arrived home on a Monday evening. When I flew, it was Monday when I got the news about him having the second stroke. And as I got to the hospital, I was totally unprepared for what I was going to see. I went into his room in the intensive care unit. The only noise was the constant beep of the EKG machine. My dad was laying in the bed with his eyes closed. He had a tube taped into his mouth, and he was breathing by way of an artificial ventilator. In my life, I had never imagined I would ever see my dad like this. And I went to his bedside and I grabbed his hand in my two hands, one of which had a plaster cast on it. I had broken my hand several weeks earlier in a game, and the routine was I'd practice all week with the cast on. Then day of the game, the doctor would take the cast off. They'd tape my hand. I'd play in the game with a heavily taped hand. And then right after the game, in the locker room, the doctor was there and he'd put a new cast on me for the next week. So as I grabbed my dad's hand with my two hands, somehow he felt that plaster cast and he knew it was me. And suddenly big tears came out of his closed eyes and streamed down his cheeks. He couldn't speak, obviously. There was nothing to say. He couldn't open his eyes. But those tears said it all. And it was a gut-wrenching, surreal experience for me. And I wiped the tears from his cheeks and I kissed him on the forehead. And I remember I then went down the hallway in the hospital, went into the men's room, and I literally became physically ill. I threw up. I was sick to my stomach. And of course, questions started to race through my mind. My dad was all of 55 years old. He was a young man. I started to think, how long would the doctors agree to keep him on life support? What would my mom do without my dad if he should die? And what would I and my brothers do without him? I mean, we went to him for everything. Whenever we needed an answer, we went to Dad. And as I said, it was a very dark, difficult, confusing moment in my life and for my entire family. 2 days later, on Wednesday, my mom and my older brother sat me down in one of the waiting rooms at the hospital. My mom looked me in the eye. She had a very stern look, very serious look, which was very unusual for my mom. And she looked at me and she said, "You need to go back to school. We have no idea how long your dad will be like this, but you have a game to play this Saturday. You need to get back to school." And at that moment, I got to tell you, my upcoming game day was the farthest thing from my mind. I couldn't believe that I would have to leave Buffalo with my dad in his current state and go back to school. And then she said something to me I would remember the rest of my life. She said, "You need to understand something. There's a time to be gentle and a time to be tough. And this is a time to be tough." And there was no further discussion. I went into my dad's hospital room. I quietly held his hand, told him how much I loved him, kissed him on the cheek, not knowing if I would ever see him alive again. And that afternoon, I was on an airplane back to Ohio, where I would try to prepare for game day on Saturday, November 7th, 1971. As I walked across campus that Saturday morning, it dawned on me that it was Parents' Weekend on campus. Everywhere I looked, I saw classmates and friends joyfully walking the campus with their moms and dads. They were laughing, taking pictures, arms around one another. I mean, you get the picture. It's Parents' Weekend on a college campus, a fun, festive fall weekend. But not for me. I got to the stadium. When I got into the locker room, I actually grabbed my equipment and a uniform and so forth, and I pretty much avoided everybody. I kind of went back into a corner where I got dressed, and I didn't want to talk much. Now, I will also tell you, very honestly, I wasn't the most social person on game day anyways. I took football very seriously. I took my personal performances very seriously. It was kind of my nature not to be the most sociable guy before games. But this day, I didn't want to talk to anybody. It was very, very very different. And most of my teammates, I think, understood that and respected that. They knew their parents were going to be in the stands cheering for them, not to mention most of the student body was there with their parents. It's just part of Parents' Weekend. The football game is one of the major highlights on the agenda of that weekend. But for me, my mom and dad were back in Buffalo, New York. My dad in a coma, fighting for his life, and my mom faithfully at his bedside. And as I ran onto the field that day and looked up at the crowd, and there were parents everywhere, and I thought to myself, what the heck are you doing here? I mean, your dad's at home in a hospital room fighting for his life. Your mom is at his side, and here you are out in Ohio getting ready to play in a football game. Why are you even here? And that was the moment. I broke down and I began to cry. Yep. Big tough college football player began to cry right there on the 33-yard line on the south end of Community Stadium in Ashland, Ohio. And without even thinking, I dropped down on one knee and I began to pray. It was the only thing I knew to do in that moment. And I remember asking God for forgiveness for all of the sinful things I had done, for all the times I had walked away from Him. And I won't lie, I was bargaining with God. I was thinking I need to pray to Him because if I ask for forgiveness and I come to Him now, maybe He can heal my dad. I had grown up in the church, I knew right from wrong. Gosh, I'm 20 years old. But like many of us, I hadn't been strong enough. I hadn't been brave enough to do the right thing many times in my young life. So I asked for forgiveness. And then I asked God to heal my dad. And yes, I said to God, if healing my dad is not part of your plan, if my dad is to die, then please somehow make me, my brothers, and my mom strong enough to endure and go forward without our dad in this life. And as I closed my prayer with a quiet amen, I lifted my head and opened my eyes and saw that two of my teammates had knelt with me, each with one hand on my shoulders. They had been praying along with me. You see, that particular game day, I made the choice. I made the absolute ultimate choice to put my trust in God's hands, and more importantly, to serve Jesus Christ for the rest of my life. Saturday, November 7th, 1971, without question, was the most important game day of my life. And did God answer my prayer? Did God come through for me in that day, in that dark moment of my life? Oh, did He ever. He did, and He has answered my prayers ever since. Because on that day, that game day, I came to realize all over again that while we live on this planet, we should treat every day as though it is a game day. The scripture tells us, this is the day the Lord hath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. We can go to Psalm 118, verse 24 to read those words. Every day we are alive is a gift from God. And yes, every day is special. It matters not how we might be struggling or dealing with pain at the time on any of those given days, because again, we are reassured in Scripture that the God we worship is good. We can go to Romans 8:28 and we read these words, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Called according to His purpose, not necessarily ours. Even with my dad at home in that intensive care unit at the hospital, I needed to put my trust in God, knowing that somehow we would survive what seemed like the darkest moment of our family's life, that somehow things would work out because God does cause all things to work together for good outcomes. This was my ultimate game day, November 7th, 1971, without question, the most important game day of my life. You know what? We won that day. We won, as a matter of fact, we pounded our opponent. We won 45-7. As for me, though, I won the biggest victory of my life. I found my way back to Jesus Christ on that game day, something I had pledged to do when I was 13 years old, and I was baptized in the church that my parents had founded. As for my dad, amazingly, he recovered from the stroke and lived another 13 years as a stroke person. He eventually learned to walk with an ortho cane. He even learned to ride a bike again. Sadly, he had a condition. He was aphasic. He could never speak fluently again, so he never was able to go back to work. But instead, he never quit. He never gave up. He actually got to the point where he did over 2,000 hours of volunteer work at the very hospital, Millard Fillmore Hospital, where he had been treated when he initially had his stroke. He worked in the admin offices. They would give him jobs to do, stuffing envelopes and delivering mail to various departments in the hospital. And yes, he would even go up on the wing in the hospital where the other stroke patients were, and he would try to encourage them and tell them that they could have a life after stroke just like he was enjoying his life. And if that wasn't enough, my mom and dad founded something called the Western New York Stroke Association to help other stroke persons and their caregivers to at least have a social outlet and the chance to find comfort and support with other stroke persons and their caregivers. I mean, when someone in your family has a stroke, you become part of a new community with other stroke people. And my mom and dad wanted to encourage these people to find strength through one another. It's amazing how they responded with such strength and perseverance that could have only come from God after my dad had a stroke. As I think back on all that my parents did after my dad's stroke, it brings me to one final verse of scripture that seems all too appropriate for me not to mention in this podcast, and that's from Jeremiah 29, verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. That day, when I knelt on the football field at Community Stadium, God knew what he was doing. After all, this is God's world, and we are not the ones in charge. He knew that from my dad's stroke, it was part of what was going to bring me back to Jesus Christ on that very day, the most important game day of my life. God knew that out of my dad's stroke would come enormous good that would touch countless lives. He knew my mom would be an amazing caregiver who would be strong enough to give my dad an unbelievable quality of life, even though he had had this stroke. Their efforts to form this Western New York Stroke Association ended up touching hundreds of lives, people that had had strokes that otherwise might not have had that social outlet. I mean, it was all good, and it was all part of God's plan. And for those 13 years that my dad survived as a stroke person, more than ever before in our lives, my brothers and I learned and saw by our mom and dad's example that every day is a gift, every day is special, and every day should be treated like game day. So now you know why I have chosen to name my podcast Game Day Every Day. I want to remind myself and anyone who listens to my podcast that when you make the choice to bring the living presence of Jesus Christ into your life and to live your life as he commanded us to live, to love God with all of our heart and all of our soul and our mind, and in much the same way to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. When we do that, even the most boring and mundane day can become the most exhilarating game day of your life. What might be the very best day of your life? Every day is special, and yes, every day is a gift. And as I close this podcast, if you're not sure about that, I've got a suggestion for you. I want you to try this. When you get up tomorrow morning and your feet hit the floor, before you take a single step out of your bed, look to the heavens and recite these words. This is the day the Lord hath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. You do that, and trust me, you'll be ready to take on whatever comes at you because God will be with you in all that you do every step of the way. I certainly hope that in some small way my message, the story I shared with you today, has inspired you and enriched your life. I hope that it brought you hope and reassurance and the simple reminder that you too are a loved child of God and that God has a plan for you in this life. So until next time, this is Bud Boughton reminding you to make today a game day for Jesus Christ. Because after all, it's game day every day.
Thanks for listening to Game Day Every Day with Coach Bud Boughton. Connect for more at budboughton.com. Be sure to subscribe to the Shine.fm podcast channel for new episodes.